Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So today we're going to be doing a series Emulation Night School where I show you how to set up some of the most popular emulators out there, what games you should be playing on them, how to get your controllers configured, how to deal with all the BIOS files, and do everything else just to make sure you can start playing some games you want today. And this one has been one of the most requested episodes so far, Ares emulation for Nintendo 64 and Nintendo 64 DD. It's like pretty much everything where a lot of people request it. I bet nobody watches it whatsoever, and it absolutely tanks in the views. But if you want to play Nintendo 64 and Nintendo 64 DD today, you can use Ares. It is my favorite emulator if I'm going to use software emulation for Nintendo 64. Now granted, I usually use Mr. FPJ, but I understand that everyone has one, so this is definitely the leading emulator in my opinion. It's very accurate and looks exactly like it should. And just so you know, Ares is a multi-system emulator. There's a ton of different emulators that work within Ares, but we are just focusing on Nintendo 64 and DD today. If you want tutorials for other Ares emulators, leave me a comment down below and let me know. But it supports a metric crap ton of systems, and that is always awesome. Kind of feels like an alternative to RetroArch, except it's using all of the different Ares emulators inside of it, and this is a continuation of a previous multi-emulator out there. But again, focusing on Nintendo 64 and Nintendo 64 DD today, because that's what you guys asked for. And the good thing is the actual compatibility on the Nintendo 64 is absolutely spectacular here. It's going to play like 99.9% of the entire retail library, North America, PAL, as well as Japan. So you're going to get the most out of something like Ares emulation. Now to download it, there is a big download button on the homepage, and you'll see here it's available for Windows, for Linux, as well as Mac OS and FreeBSD. Obviously all of my tutorials are predicated on Windows, but I may do a few Mac specific ones in the future if you guys are interested. On the Windows side of things, you're going to see that there's more than one executable, and you're going to see that on the Linux and Mac OS side as well. But as far as Windows is concerned, you're going to use the AMD 64 button. I highly doubt anyone here is using ARM compatible Windows 10 or Windows 11. If you are, leave me a comment down below because I would be very surprised. So to download Ares, just go ahead and click Windows AMD 64 and it'll download it to your download folder. And just so you're aware, this isn't an installation, it's an unpack. Ares will live in whatever folder you put it in, so just decide where you want it to live and move that zip file over, and then go ahead and unzip it like any other file you've ever unzipped before. It'll create a folder and it'll call itself Ares. That's how you know everything has worked perfectly fine. Once you're done with that, you can go ahead and just delete the zip file if you want, just to keep everything cleaned up. So within the Ares Windows folder, you'll see here we're going to have a subfolder, and it's going to be the version of Ares you have, Ares-version 141. That is the most current as of the recording of this video, and you're going to see an executable, Ares.exe. That's where we're going to first launch and start getting this set up. Once you load the window up here, you're going to have an option called Load, and that is going to allow you to load games into every single emulator Ares is compatible with as far as systems are concerned. Obviously, again, Nintendo 64 and DD is what we're focused on today, but there are a ton of different emulators in here, and this first part is going to get you set up as far as Ares is concerned. We have to do a few things in the settings if we're actually able to play any games, especially for DD, so we'll go ahead and focus on that there. At the bottom here, you're going to see a bunch of different options, and we're going to start with video and move around. As far as the video settings are concerned, at least for Nintendo 64, I recommend leaving everything as is. It'll do the best job of making Nintendo 64 just look like Nintendo 64. Now do be aware that this isn't like other Nintendo 64 emulators. We can up the internal rendering resolution or do a ton of things to the image. This is basically going to look and feel like the Nintendo 64 you grew up with. You can play a little bit around with the weave, the interlacing quality, but otherwise leave everything as is. If you want to change the volume, you have that as well. But the most important thing we have to do is bind a controller to the Nintendo 64, or else nothing is going to be controllable. I know that kind of trips people up in the past. If you click Virtual Gamepad, you're going to see a drop-down menu for every single console Ares can emulate. So we picked Nintendo 64, and you're going to see you also have it for DD, but if you just bind Nintendo 64, it'll persist to DD as well in my testing. You'll see here that you get different button inputs depending on what actual emulator you're on. So popping back over to Nintendo 64, we have the entire controller configuration here. All you need to do is plug in any controller you want to use, double click on the input, and then push the corresponding button on your controller. Once you've got all the way down the line, you are perfectly good to go. If you screw up, you can just hit clear and it'll clear everything out. If you misbind a couple controls, you can just go ahead and double click and fix them. It really is absolutely easy, and once you've assigned everything here, you'll be 100% good to control the game inside. And hotkeys, the one thing I recommend is just binding a key to save states and load states. There is not anything by default. I use F1 and F2 for that. And if you do the following, you're at least going to be able to control your Nintendo 64 games, and that is going to make a big difference between being able to play them or just watching them run. Now be aware, on the Nintendo 64 side of things, you do not need any BIOS, you do not need any PIF chips. All you need are the game files that you've dumped from your collection, and to go ahead and launch them, which I'll show you how to do in just a few moments. But if you're wondering where to put the BIOS files for Nintendo 64, you put them nowhere because it is not required. And if you only want to see a few emulators in the load menu, you can go ahead and deselect anything you want here. As far as the options are concerned, the 4MB expansion pack is enabled by default, and I don't believe there's many games that'll throw errors with it if it's actually installed, but if you find one that does, you can deselect it in option. Now you'll see an option for firmwares, and this is basically BIOS, except they call it firmware. And as far as the Nintendo 64 DD is concerned, there's a big pitfall here, and that is if you read directions online, it's going to tell you to use a certain set of files, but 64dd_ipl.bin is the only one you need in the firmware folder inside of the Ares installation. The only other thing you need to do is set where the firmware is actually looking at. So if you go ahead and hit assign, you'll navigate with the Windows menu to wherever you've actually installed Ares. You'll see Ares 141 here. I created a firmware folder, and I went ahead and dropped all of the different disparate firmwares for the DD in there, but the file I just showed you is the one that's going to load everything up. Every other file I tried just ended up black screening. You'll see here I've already assigned it, but if you go ahead and just click scan at the bottom left hand corner, it'll scan the folder that you just assigned, and as long as it finds the right file, it'll show up in the list. If it doesn't find the right file that I just mentioned to you, that means it's not the correct file in the first place. So from there, if we hit load and go to Nintendo 64, that's how you're going to launch games. You can go ahead and pick whatever game you want. I put them in a games list folder inside of Ares, but you can execute them from wherever they're living on your hard drive. And that's all you need to do to play Nintendo 64 games on Ares. You bind your controls, you set your options, and you go ahead and load the game up. And as long as all of your controls are bound correctly, you'll be 100% ready to play the entirety of the Nintendo 64 library. Whether you're on something like PAL, NTSC, Japanese region, it will all just work, and that is a really nice thing. It's a set it and forget it. Just binding the controls and getting Ares installed is the most intensive process of running Nintendo 64 games. And when they're actually running, this thing is hyper accurate. I compare it against Mr. FPJ and the FPJ recreation of a Nintendo 64. I compare it against an original Nintendo 64, and 99.9% of the time, Ares does exactly what I would expect it to do. There's a few bugs in there that you won't see on Mr. FPJ, but they're extremely minimal. Now, if you want to load Nintendo 64 DD games, you'll go to the load menu, and you'll go to DD, not to Nintendo 64. And be aware, the first time you launch a 64 DD game, you're going to get stuck on this screen. It is an error screen because the time is not set. Go ahead and hold down the A button for like 3 seconds, don't let it go until you see the menu switch over to the date and time. Go ahead and set your date and time, hit A, and then the game will load up. That also seems to throw a lot of people. And while there's not a ton to play on the Nintendo 64 DD, it is an incredibly expensive console, and Ares is the best way to experience the library that does exist. Something like Doshin the Giant here is worth playing. Something like the F-Zero expansion pack, also worth playing, but I will not show any Nintendo-owned games and emulation tutorials moving forward on the channel because Nintendo is notorious for taking issue with that, so we don't show their games anymore. But definitely check out the DD library. There is a lot of fun to be had there. And because the expansion pack is enabled, you'll see in certain games like Castlevania Legacy of Darkness here, it's going to allow you to pick a resolution, low or high, which will increase the resolution of the game. On real Nintendo 64 hardware, that could cause a little bit of slowdown. On the stock Mr. FPGA core, it also caused a little bit of slowdown, but in areas in the Nintendo 64 Turbo FPGA core, you can get the higher resolution. You can also get a better frame rate. Just be aware that this is an interlace source. It's 480i, not 240p, so you will see some interlacing lines when you're using Aries. And of course, there's a ton of different filters to go and play around with, but I leave that up to you guys because teaching you filters, I do not know what it is you'd like to see. There's a whole menu option. You just click it and it appears, and you decide whether you like it or not. But if you follow all the directions in this tutorial, you'll be playing Nintendo 64 games, and you'll be playing Nintendo 64 DD games. And if you run into any issues whatsoever, remember I do have that Emulation Night School link below on my Patreon, so you can get custom chat support with me. But if you pay attention to the tutorial, I don't think anyone's going to need that, and you'll be able to play the entirety of the 64 and DD library on Aries with no issues whatsoever. And again, if you want to see different Aries tutorial emulation videos, tell me some systems down below, because I'll keep doing Emulation Night School so long as people keep watching it. And this was the #1 request I was getting in, so hopefully people actually wanted to see it. But it is an outstanding emulator that'll run everything Nintendo 64. You can just play and forget about it. But short of that, we're done, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.